the film Hate Among Us. I'm the executive director of Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and we're proud to be a partner in presenting this important film and discussion along with Congregation Beth Torah, Adult Ed, Highlights, and Sisterhood. Many thanks to the J and presenting sponsor Pegasus Bank for pivoting to bring us this virtual film festival during this time of social distancing. As we have all found ways to adjust during the pandemic, DJHS has found a way to continue our oral history project with Zoom interviews. Check out our website, djhs.org, to find all the ways you can contribute your story to the story of Dallas Jewry. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Cheryl Drazin to help us unpack the film, Hate Among Us. As Vice President of ADL's Central Division, Cheryl Drazin and her team work daily to fight anti-Semitism and all forms of hate in the Austin, Texoma, Mountain States, Southwest, and Omaha regional offices. Cheryl received a BA degree in political science from Washington University in St. Louis and earned a JD from the University of Texas School of Law. Prior to joining ADL, Cheryl was an attorney where her practice focused on labor and employment litigation. She joined ADL in 2013 as the Jean and Jerry Moore Southwest Civil Rights Council. In 2016, Cheryl became the regional director for the Dallas Regional Office. And Cheryl, it's all you.
Thank you, Deborah, very much. It is so nice to get to see so many of you this evening. I wish we could all be in the same room together. And I thought, in order to kind of frame the film that we all just saw, I would start with a story about the first time I recognized anti-Semitism. So I'm going to take you back in time to the early 1990s and Shreveport, Louisiana, my hometown that is without power tonight and unfortunately suffering terribly due to Laura. But if you recall, David Duke had just run for governor and was just narrowly defeated by Edwin Edwards, who at the time was a fairly known crook. It was one of the best of normal Louisiana politics kinds of shows. But the Klan that had been really, really quiet in northern Louisiana had gained a lot of notoriety. And I was working that summer in the Caddo Parish Clerk's office. Like a county, the parish is the state government system, and I was in charge of the microfiche room. Again, where my superpower was the ability to alphabetize without looking on the chart on the wall. And my friend Greg and I were alphabetizing in a dark room where microfiche is kept because you have to light it up in order to use it. And there were thick velvet curtains with a certain mustiness that only a state government building can have. And we knew that the Klan would be marching that day in front of the courthouse. And we pulled back the curtains. Again, it's noon, bright as day. And it was the first time I'd ever seen the Klan march in uniform. And I have to say, I can smell the mustiness of the curtains, and I can still feel the shiver go down my back to look at 25 people hooded and covered walking in a circle. And my colleague Greg looked at me and said, you know, those people hate you. And I said, I know. He said, you know, they hate me too. He was African American. I said, I know. He said, and when they see you, they won't know they hate you. When they see me, they know. That's what makes us different. And it was such an awakening moment for me to realize that hate among us looks different and feels different. And that's really where I want to start my thinking about this modern film about anti-Semitism and the rise in hate crimes created by non-Jews. So many times I am asked by people, does the non-Jewish community care about anti-Semitism? Are they interested? And I thought this film was such an opportunity to illustrate that exactly what they said, that hate happening to any of us is hate happening to all of us. And I recall when Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of ADL, took his role about 5 years ago, he said on his initial speaking tour that his biggest worry was that he would wake up one morning and pick up his phone and see that something had happened terrible overnight in Europe to a Jewish community, that something had gone wrong. And when I saw him immediately after Tree of Life, he said what an amazing awakening it had been for him, to realize that his greatest fear had happened right here. And so if we, going back, not even the last 5 years, the last 4 years, and kind of using the markers of Charlottesville, Tree of Life, Poway, and Jersey City, thinking about those anti-Semitic incidents happening in our country, I think takes this whole, what people sometimes think about as a historical documentary or a historical story, and turns it very much, I think, into a current event. And I really want to use that framework of current event as we think about what has gotten us to where we are and how we're going to move forward. And I didn't feel like the film necessarily gave a firm definition of anti-Semitism, more of a you know it when you see it kind of thing. And so I wanted to start with a baseline, at least, definition of anti-Semitism being a form of prejudice or discrimination that is depicted towards Jews as individuals and as a group. Anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes and on myths that target Jews as a people, their religious practices and beliefs, and the Jewish state of Israel. So that's an umbrella definition, but I think it pretty much encapsulates the various areas that the film spoke about. And just to give you a little bit of feel, ADL started 113 years ago with a dual mission to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. For 40 years, we have been tracking actual incidents of anti-Semitism. So I don't want to paint a picture that I'm giving you a century's worth of information. I don't have that to share. But I do want to take us at least historically through the context of the changing face of anti-Semitism, because as you all know, Mark Twain has told us that history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so let's go to what many people think of as one of the first points of anti-Semitism in the United States. And we'll go back to 1917 and the lynching of Leo Frank. Leo Frank was a New York businessman who relocated to Atlanta. And in the early 1900s, he was brought in to be the general manager of a pencil factory. And this was well before direct deposit. As the general manager, he signed everyone's paycheck every week, and they were distributed in paper. Mary Fagan was found dead on the floor of the pencil factory, holding a check signed by Leo Frank. That was the piece of incriminating evidence that a jury used to convict Leo Frank of her murder. When the jury was seated in Georgia at this time, that was high into all of the isms, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, you name it, it was right there in Atlanta. You look at some of the questions to the jury. Can you trust Mr. Frank? Can you be objective? And people answered clearly, he's a Jew, I wouldn't trust him, and we're seated on the jury. The actual verdict came back very, very quickly, which I'm sure everybody has seen enough good law movies or television shows to know that when something comes back so quickly, it is normally not in the defendant's favor. He was found guilty, and the governor of Georgia was incredibly concerned about what he felt was a malfeasance of justice, but he also recognized that he had a community up in arms, and what was he going to do? So he did the only thing that he thought he could, and he commuted the sentence to life in prison. And he moved Leo Frank as far away from Atlanta as he possibly could to the outskirts of his jurisdiction, Marietta. It's kind of funny if you think about Marietta being the outskirts of Atlanta today, but at the time it was. And the concern was so incredible by the community, it didn't die with the verdict. The group of people were joined together called a vigilante community. And the vigilante committee was not outcasts, were not people on the random ends of the spectrum, but they were leaders in the community. They were the sheriff, they were the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, they were active members of the school board. And they said, look, the governor absolutely played us. We had a decision and we got played. And they went to Marietta in August of 1917, and they took Leo Frank from his cell and they hung him. And if you look on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution, August 17th, 1917, kill the Jew, kill the Jew, kill the Jew is the headline. That was chanted as he hung there to hang. And all of the media at the time showed the face of Leo Frank. And that was seen as the optics, as the poster child of anti-Semitism. Now move up less than 20 years and we have Hitler. Hitler is shown as the face of anti-Semitism. That's a pretty short amount of time for there to be such a flip from the victim to the perpetrator to show anti-Semitism, but we're in a position where we're looking at the actor, not the victim anymore, and go through all of the World War II history that you know, who the leaders were, what the mantras were. But when you saw a picture, when you heard a voice on the radio, you weren't hearing about the victim. You were hearing about the perpetrator. But you saw them and you recognized them. And when you saw the swastika or when you saw the leader's face, you knew exactly how to associate it. Move into the 60s and back to my story about the Klan, literally those who were projecting hate were hiding themselves underneath something, not showing their faces at all. Again, we're still seeing it from the perpetrator's point of view, but we can't identify them. We know what they represent, but we don't know who they are. And for those of you who are fans of civil rights work, you know that there was tremendous legal action taken to demask the Klan, to allow people to congregate, to associate with whatever vile beliefs they wanted to spew, but very much the desire to be able to identify who they were. And then the Klan gets more sophisticated. As I shared in my opening story, David Duke, who projects himself with an academic background, gets elected. He's on television shows. He runs his own effective media to some point where he absolutely is pushing out his ideas. And most recently, the face gets even more sophisticated. From our own neighborhood, Richard Spencer comes out as a polished, well-spoken, articulate, educated leader on some of these issues. So if you really take that snapshot of 100 years of what the hate looks like, you see tremendous change. And I don't want to downplay anti-Semitism in Europe. I saw my colleague in the film, Sharon Nazarian, ADL's Senior Vice President for International Affairs. And that's a desk that ADL keeps because we continue to know that anti-Semitism is an issue throughout the world. Our Global 100 survey, which is really not 100 countries, but it pulls together data on a very regular basis that tells us things that are candidly frightening. That we know that a fourth of Europeans fall into a category that we would consider to be holding anti-Semitic beliefs of the countries that we continue to look at, that stereotypes about Jewish control of business and financial markets trend over Europe in the same way that we see tropes here, and that the trope of dual loyalty, of the notion that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to their home country, is believed by more than 40% of Europeans. And that is a significant data point, I think, for us to operate in, particularly as we enter a more global world and global economy. I do not have to give you the history lesson of world leaders on the international stage not being bashful about sharing anti-Semitic ideas, anti-Semitic tropes, and recognizing that the realities are that people are hearing these things not just in small offbeat communities, but large metropolitan areas in Europe with real Jewish populations are having the same kinds of concerns that probably honestly 20 years ago we were categorizing or explaining as small pods or remote ideas. And candidly, we were doing the same things locally. When we were really seeing Klan activity, we weren't seeing it in the middle of downtown Dallas necessarily. There was plenty of Klan activity in Dallas, but if you wanted a good picnic invitation, you needed to go to Waxahachie or Burleson. East Texas was a great way to get involved. Today, technology allows people to connect with other people who they will never meet face to face, not just because of COVID restrictions, but because they have the ability to share ideas and not to have to create critical mass in order to organize. And that's a tremendous, tremendous factor in where we are today. You also met my colleague, Jeroen Ezekson, in the film, who has my position in the Mid-Atlantic area. So he was on the ground for Charlottesville, what was an awakening, really and truly, for both the for both the civil rights community, for the American Jewish community, and particularly because while we have seen pockets of activity come up, the actual groups of people getting themselves to Charlottesville, attendees at Unite the Right came from 47 states in the United States. It wasn't just surrounding UVA, just, the southern states. And these were people who had created GoFundMe pages. Get me to Charlottesville, please give me $5. Give me $10 to buy gas so that I can drive from Oregon. They had collection routes along the way where if I was driving from Oregon, I'll stop in Wyoming and pick you up. And from Wyoming, we can stop in Illinois and grab somebody else. These are people who had no connection to one another other than the desire to get to this rally together. It was something that we have really not seen in a ever, candidly. And the trend of people being able to unite that way and to have a shared culture without having shared language, without having shared experience, is really a pivot point for where as a country we are on some of the issues of anti-Semitism. As I shared, ADL's been collecting that data for 40 years. The first anti-Semitic audit came out in 1979, and we've always divided anti-Semitic activity into 3 buckets. One bucket, assault, exactly what it sounds like, physical harm to another person. The second bucket is vandalism, harm to property, and the third bucket is harassment. Now, you can imagine that there are more incidents of harassment than there are of vandalism, and more incidents of vandalism than there are of assault. But watching both the aggregate number as well as the trends of where each of those is moving is fairly significant. So to steal the headline, 2019 saw the most incidence of anti-Semitic activity the United States has ever seen. Right over 2,100 incidents were reported to ADL. Compare that to 2018, which was slightly lower, 1,879. But even with that lower number, there was more violence than there had been in 2017. In 2017, there were 1,986 incidents. If you take it over a decade period, you see a growing trend, but again, those numbers tend to be smaller in violence, and harassment has increased over time. In our own backyard, right here in the DFW area, we're seeing the same trends. We were up 22% in anti-Semitic incidents from 2018 to 2019. And just to give you a feel for the kinds of things that we're seeing, the Tom Thumb at Preston and Forest, that parking lot was flyered. Cars were covered with flyers from the Black Hebrew Israelites, encouraging people to join. So I would say their PR team didn't exactly know where they should be going. It's not exactly the area you're going to expect to find a lot of people willing to sign up. Clearly, you've heard, I'm sure, about Black Hebrew Israelites, particularly after Muncie and New Jersey last year. But absolutely, normally we only see Black Hebrew Israelites in downtown Dallas. They usually are, they don't tend to have a propensity for violence, but flyering is pretty common. We've seen a lot of flyering on college campuses, public and private, throughout North Texas, but this was the first time we'd seen an actual targeted grocery store, that says kosher market when you're standing outside. The John Clay Wolfe radio show had produced a picture on its website, Facebook page, that had it looks like you're in front of AT&T Stadium and you're seeing a sign that is for parking, and there is a cash price and a credit card price. The cash price is lower, and written next to it is I've jewed them down to get this price, and then comments going on in the Facebook chat below. And of the 30 comments, they were about half and half. Some were absolutely amplifying the message. Oh my goodness, that's exactly right. You have to get a better deal this way. And some were saying, it's 2019, people. You don't say that. It's not acceptable. It's not okay. And when we reached out to the show, they administered the page, but they were not the ones commenting. It was a fascinating conversation, both at why the statement is so offensive and at how it could be taken as being an anti-Semitic slur. They did remove it immediately, but were absolutely blown away that the conversation had happened and had caused so much frustration for other people. In Oklahoma City, the Democratic Committee headquarters in the Chickasaw Nation happened to share a physical building. And whomever did the graffiti work was an equal opportunity offender. There was plenty of anti-LGBT language, anti-Black language, anti-Jewish language. It was everywhere, and the mayor of Oklahoma City came out very strongly, saying that Oklahoma City values diversity and doesn't appreciate trespassing or vandalism. And when the perpetrator was found, she didn't meet any of the demographics. It was a middle-aged white woman who is not your typical anti-Semitic spray painter. That's not normally who we find. It's still fairly unclear what her motivation was, other than just general disdain for everyone. We have recently had a KKK business card mailed to a synagogue, wrapped in an envelope, wrapped in paper that just says "Watch out" in handwriting. Local school boards have had members making anti-Semitic statements, and they have been forced by their own governance structures to step down. So that gives you a little bit of flavor for where we are locally. Clearly on the national scene, we are seeing plenty of activity. 4th of July, you probably remember the Farrakhan address, which was anti-Semitism spewed just like it has been before. In the sports world, Deshaun Jackson out of Philadelphia this summer with incredibly strong statements, then kind of followed up by Nick Cannon and Ice Cube. Nick Cannon has come out kind of doing an apology tour, saying that he didn't realize the impact of what he said. And then we're seeing other people in the sports and entertainment area come out and articulate the impact that anti-Semitism has on all communities, and particularly the African-American community. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Charles Barkley both released very public statements on how anti-Semitism has no place, and anybody who cares about hate against their own community has to care about hate against all communities. And so I think that is going to be a really interesting place where we see people kind of lining up in multiple camps right now of where they're going to put down their support, and how, particularly in a country that is committed right now to talking about systemic racism, how we are going to talk about hate against other people. In the film, they referred to hate crimes and the rise of hate crimes. Just to give that a little bit of framing for a discussion, I really want to call attention to the fact that of religious groups, we know that Jews are impacted by hate crimes more than other religious groups. Racial hate crimes are still higher percentage-wise if we're going to take the whole hate crime pie and break it down. But for sure, in the religious area, even after seeing a tremendous uptick after 9/11 in Muslim American hate crimes, that number has stayed high. It has never gone back down to where it was pre-9/11, but it doesn't hold a candle to where we are against hate crimes in the Jewish community, which does in many ways make our law enforcement community particularly interested in working with the Jewish community, Jewish communal organizations, in figuring out how to be not reactive, but proactive in the Jewish community, how to figure out how targeting is going to occur and things like that. So I guess there's lemonade to be made out of all kinds of lemons, but it has given, even in the FBI office, crimes against the Jewish community get a higher level of attention because of the tremendous number. And so I do want to open the chat. I'm not paying attention to it, I have to admit, but I would love to have a discussion and get your questions from the film or from what's going on around us to try and integrate the two.
I know there was a question that came in beforehand. Just, I'm going to try to locate it really quickly.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, Adina, do you have that?
I will also look for it.
Great.
In the meantime, there's a question in the chat. Can you address the RNC condemning this Southern Poverty Law Center?
I can share what I know for sure. And the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is, an organization that spends a lot of time looking at hate, has a slightly different definition of hate than the ADL. And my understanding is that the RNC condemnation is over that broader approach. But I have to say that I do not have specific details on that. I would be curious if anyone, even if we can do like show of hands or in reactions, as to whether people have seen an uptick themselves in anti-Semitism, whether it be harassment or in our own community? I see more questions coming in, but I would love that information. I'm kind of scrolling through if people will give a feel for whether they, in the last year, feel like they have observed more anti-Semitism, whether it's in social media or rhetoric or.
So we're seeing yes in social media. And
Okay.
Diana Caesar has a question. As a brown-skinned Jew, how would you suggest dealing with disdain and mistrust from within the Jewish community and from outside it?
I think it's a fabulous, fabulous question. Look, I think that Jews can exhibit, the Jewish community, I'm using the umbrella term of Jewish community, Jews can be anti-Semitic. It is true. And I think that people have to be called on it. I think that we, and I particularly see this in Southern Jewish communities, we have a nicety and a politeness that my grandmother would appreciate deeply about, bless his heart, he didn't mean that. Bless her heart, there is no way she knows me, she couldn't have said that. And while I'm not suggesting that yelling and screaming is always the right response, I do think that when we're silent on things, there's a tacit consent implied. And I think that there is a responsibility, it's a heavy burden to have to care, but to speak out when something happens. Now, sometimes we don't realize that something's happened until 20 minutes or 2 hours or 2 days later. I still think even in that, there's a responsibility in going back to the speaker, to the venue, to the experience and saying, I don't know what your intent was, but I want to share what the impact was. Because I think that by and large, we have a lot of people who don't realize the impact of what they're saying. From outside the Jewish community, and again, I think this film is such an excellent example of the reality that so many have realized that that hate's fairly equal opportunity. When someone hates a particular group, they don't channel all of their hate just there. They're really willing to spread it out. And so that hate against anyone could be hate against everyone. And I think it's experience. I think it is having people get to know people, working with people, and making your choices known about why you aren't associating with a person or a group moving forward. A question about Dallas stacking up against other large cities. It's a hard analysis to run because I'll first talk about similar sized Jewish communities. Against similar sized Jewish communities, we're about the same. So roughly 70,000 Jews. About similar sized cities, there's a little bit of differentiation. You know, if you look at Texas having arguably the 3 of the 10 largest cities, although Austin sits on that number 11 cusp so much that they try to jump in, the numbers in Texas are not the same as the numbers in California, New York, Illinois, or Florida, which would have more Jews, but not necessarily more population. So it's city to city is a little bit hard. I think Jewish community to Jewish community, you still tend to see, if you turned the country into a heat map where incidents popped up, the larger the Jewish community, the more incidents there are. There are other one-to-one correlations there. When there is tension in the Middle East, there's an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents in this country. That has been historic since 1948. When there is economic downturn in this country, there is an uptick in any sort of hate incident across any minority group, and it always impacts the Jewish community disproportionately. Again, just like hate crimes do. So not out of proportion to how the Jewish community is impacted, But if I had a crystal ball, which is unfortunately on back order with my Lysol wipes, I would say the expected economic downturn that we are likely to see is going to increase hate incidents. Now, remember, I just told you that 2019 was the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents in this country, and arguably a tremendously good economy overall. But economic downturn is always a correlation.
I see another question here, Cheryl. How can we address this problem when we have anti-Semitism in the government?
I am going to assume a piece of the question. And so if I'm wrong, I hope somebody will correct me. Because as far as the actual structure of government, we always have had an envoy to anti-Semitism, actual actual support and resources to deal with anti-Semitism. But if we are talking about the current administration's policy of dog whistling, whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant, there's definitely a correlation between public figures saying things and what we see other people being willing to do. If we start with the 2016 election cycle and go through that, you would see that correlation go up. That was a heated campaign. And the rhetoric got incredibly personal, and unlike any other national electoral campaign that we had seen, as far as that goes. And again, I think the calling out anti-Semitism, I don't think we can blame any one person. I don't think we can blame the administration, but kind of my prior advice of we have to stand up and speak out, and we have to call out anti-Semitism across the aisle. We have to call it out from the right, from the left, from the middle. As Texans, I kind of encourage us to think of it as a horseshoe, any form of extremism actually, because the reality is the right and the left are much closer together than they would be if we were truly talking about a spectrum. The bend, the middle is there, and the right and the left are closer together on their extremism.
And someone wants to know your take on QAnon.
Sure. Well, I think that QAnon is probably best dealt with by some of my colleagues in our Center on Extremism. I can tell you that as it's a conspiracy theory that we are doing a tremendous amount of training on right now for law enforcement all around the country. And the truth is, 4chan, which is the platform where QAnon started, was an image board, a message board where the letter Q was used by an individual. That's then been taken over by what's presumably a group of people. And as far as the information, most all of it has been proven to be conspiracy theory, but it is something I can tell you that law enforcement is looking at locally and nationally right now. And if you really want kind of the up-to-date, hottest pieces on it, our extremism researchers are blogging about it all the time on adl.org. You can go to QAnon and pull up the hottest, newest topics of the day.
Okay. So while the person who asked the question earlier about the government was talking about the movie and anti-Semitism depicted in the House of Representatives.
Sure. No, look, I think again that we have seen formal condemnation of these kinds of acts, and I think we have to continue to really pay attention, because there are questions. I've gotten questions all day today about some of the speeches last night at the convention. Was a reference to Wall Street elites and executive entertainment. Was that an anti-Semitic statement? The reference was made about a tax bill, and again, the context matters. So I think that in general, people in Congress get held up to a much higher standard than, the average grocery store worker, who very well may also have an anti-Semitic statement. And I can't tell you how many pieces of concern I've gotten of someone saying, I went to a manager, I went and told someone. I've never done that at the grocery store or at Target before. Most of these were pre-COVID conversations, but I've never, I'm now every time I hear something, I say something about it.
Okay. Another question is, how did the ADL react to Donald Trump specific anti-Semitic tropes used at the IAC conference in Miami?
The ADL, like many other organizations, is a 501c3. So we do not, politically, we don't support, endorse, or speak out against a candidate per se in their role as a candidate or as an elected official. But we try to call balls and strikes at the ADL. So if I upset people on the left and I upset people on the right, I've done a good day's work. It means that I am staying right there in the center, and we call those things out. Do we call out every tweet? No. There are 400 on a good day, maybe 340 full-time ADL employees. If all we did was watch social media, we wouldn't be doing a whole lot of other things. But absolutely, there's both public calling things out and speaking. I can't tell you how many members of Congress I speak to their staff members. I say, this is how it sounded in our community. This is what the letter you sent said or meant. It is not always a public chastisement. It's clearly the higher one is in government, the more likely it has to be public. But those initial conversations start on the city council, they start at the school board, because let's face it, working with elected officials as they rise in power in their communities, it's incredibly important to have those relationships and to explain the importance of both the jargon, the semantics, the syntax, and the context of what they're saying.
Thank you. So a couple of questions that asked in a slightly different way, but one is how can we do a counterattack on, and why don't we, on social media? And then another is, with the uptick in anti-Semitism, at what point do we stop talking about awareness and begin to make action plans to protect the community from another Nazi Germany scenario?
I guess, and I'm trying to look at the question so I can, so that I can pull a little bit more of the detail out. But I think the reality is we are doing a lot of proactive planning. Particularly, I would say the work with law enforcement to really understand both the security needs of the Jewish community, to understand and investigate anti-Semitic tropes when they are playing out in social media, to prevent some of those kinds of things. It's not all going to be above the fold in the Dallas Morning News or on, the 10 o'clock news kind of, if you want to call it an offensive attack. But I don't think in the organized Jewish community, and by that I'm talking rabbis, I'm talking congregations, institutions, it's a very, very hot topic about anti-Semitism that we're seeing nationally with local ties. How do we respond to it? And very much locally, tracking trends and information very, very closely. I don't think that there is a passive approach to it at all.
Okay, and then there's a big question here, but the top line is, There's been a lot in the media about systemic racism, and none of the message seems to be focusing on anti-Semitism. And I guess the question is, are we connected to that? Is it separate? What are the points of intersection?
It's a great question, and it's a really, and I'll be honest, I think it's a challenging question to answer in a post-George Floyd moment right this second. But I'll do the flip of it first and say that oftentimes when I talk to Jewish or non-Jewish communities, I usually use this example more with non-Jewish communities, that when somebody asks me, is this statement anti-Semitic? I can't tell. I don't know. I encourage them to put another group into the same sentence, into the same context, and would they take it as if you put a Black group in, would that be racist? And they're like, oh yes, that would totally be racist. I'm like, then it's anti-Semitic. Would it be homophobic if it was an LGBT group? Oh yes, then it's anti-Semitic. But I think that the point of the relationship, particularly as we're talking about systemic racism and the work that the Jewish community has done to be very clear that Judaism is not a race. So religion, maybe a culture, but that it's not a race, is the intersection of Jewish-Black relations. And I don't want to ruin the New York Times for you tomorrow morning, but I think you're going to see a lot in it. Tomorrow, August 28th, is the anniversary of Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And there'll be a tremendous amount of coverage, both on the anniversary and on what does that dream mean today. And I think you're going to see a lot about the modern role of the Jewish-Black relationship. I think that the partnership you're seeing right now at very senior levels in between organizations like the NAACP or the Urban League and Jewish organizations coming out very, very clearly saying Jews care about systemic racism and the African American community cares about anti-Semitism. Tremendous pushback. I mean, I started out with examples of the African American community absolutely saying right now is the time to talk about systemic racism, not to talk about other things, but real pushback from leadership saying, if you're going to talk about hate, we need to solve systemic racism, but if you're going to talk about hate, it's hate against everybody. This isn't Surus bingo where you get to pick that your hate is bigger or worse than my hate at any particular time.
Okay. There's a BDS question here, how to interact meaningfully in discussion when faced with anti-Semitism on college campuses. And that did come up in the film as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at just a few weeks ago at USC and a student who felt so much pressure there, I think the answer is education. I think that as painting with a very broad paintbrush, we as a Jewish community don't necessarily prepare our high school students successfully to go to college where they're going to hear other narratives and to be able to articulate why they stand for Israel, why criticism of Israel as a country, criticism of Israel's leadership and government is not anti-Semitism blatantly. Calling for the delegitimization of Israel, BDS at its core, which says Israel should be treated differently than other countries, is anti-Semitic. And having people have that basic understanding is pretty huge. And it takes a lot of work on the front end. It is a very hard defense game to play, and candidly, the other side of the narrative has done a really good job of setting it up, being very, very attractive. And I think partnering and supporting organizations that are on campus is really important, because that's where students are getting their information.
So Deborah says, and there's a question at the end, we still seem like a very passive community. When I moved here 30 years ago, Temple Shalom had anti-Semitic graffiti prior to high holidays, and their concerns seem to be get it out of sight, don't let anyone know. Have we evolved in how we respond to these kinds of incidents locally?
We have. I think we absolutely have. Again, I would put that kind of in the back to my write a nice thank you note, be polite version of we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to upset anybody here. There was graffiti 2 weeks ago at a local Jewish institution. All of the proper pictures were taken. I got them. I know the Dallas police chief got them. The FBI got them, and it was removed quickly because that they'll tell you best practice is you don't want to give the vandal the thrill of getting to see their artwork. Like that should be removed. But you also don't want to call attention to it. So there is, in working with law enforcement for sure, some best practices where there are certain things that intentionally get elevated and some that don't. We have a formal program now for monetary rewards leading to solve anti-Semitic crimes, both locally and nationally, that we have used before. Again, these are not necessarily things that I think you're going to see on the front. No one's going to scream this from the mountaintops, but we've absolutely engaged in both responding quickly to these crimes, noting them, and solving them.
Okay. If there are more questions, please put them in the chat. I'm flipping through. There are some comments that these are not really questions, but people saying that in the South, too many people say, well, I'm a Christian, as if you're not, your value system is inferior. And how are we supposed to deal with that? What is the best way to deal with that? Because that clearly, that feels like anti-Semitism when it comes through.
Absolutely. And look, I think it's the long game on that. If there was a switch to flip and we could do it quickly, I think we already would have. I think it is absolutely about experiences, about getting to know people. The data suggests that when people have a relationship with a Jewish person, clearly they universalize it. If it's a positive relationship, all Jews are wonderful. If it's a negative relationship, all Jews are horrible. And that's a normal principle that any of us may use to either to grow or narrow a group of people. It's stereotyping at its very best. But look, I've seen in the chat conversations about Holocaust education and awareness, and can education do it? We're moving in the right direction. Texas was among the first, we were in the first 13 states to pass an actual Holocaust education and genocide awareness week. There are to actually require that students have exposure in order to graduate from a Texas school. Is it enough? No, it's not enough. Absolutely not. But it is a level of awareness that I do think is coming out as far as getting people educated. I think that there are tremendous organizations all across this community that are educating teachers about Judaism, about the Holocaust, in order that they're not reading a paragraph in a textbook and checking it off as the TEK has been completed, but that they very much are being able to feel like they have both the competency and access to the resources to educate themselves and educate students.
Okay, so there's one more question that I want to bring to you, and then I have questions to a couple things that I want you to address.
Of course.
Okay, so the last question that we'll ask is, should we expect other congregations, Christian or otherwise, to speak out to the issue?
Absolutely, we should, and we see it. We see it happening with many of our interfaith organizations in town, whether it is Faith Commons, Faith Forward, Thanksgiving Square, all of those. Rochelle, I recall that during going back several years now, during the the fake JCC bombings, but there were a lot of them, multiple on our own campus here, that the first card that came in from an imam.
Yes.
You know,
true.
of actually, and I think the flip is true. I think that we should expect and encourage non-Jews to speak out about anti-Semitism. By the same token, I think we have to join their communities to speak out when they are persecuted in some way, shape, or form. I think that's a symbiotic relationship.
Okay, thank you. So now let's go to a couple of the ADL initiatives that we can participate in and that can provide us a sense of hope. Can you tell us a little bit about No Place for Hate and then talk about the ADL virtual walk?
Absolutely. So No Place for Hate is an ADL signature framework that is in Texas has the most schools participating in the country right now. Any K through 12 campus may participate. And what the community does, the school community agrees that for a year they are going to focus on what it means for their community to be a community of respect. So they can bring in whatever activities fit their community. Clearly, it's going to look different on an elementary campus than it is on a high school campus. Locally, we have about 100 campuses participating, from private schools to DISD public schools, charter schools, you name it. It's really been a tremendous way for us to bring the message of standing up, speaking out, and treating people with respect, regardless of who they are, across the board. Normally, we partner with the State Fair of Texas and do an anti-bullying seminar for the middle school kids who are participating. This year, that will be virtual as well, and we are excited. We are partnering with our Houston and Austin offices, and we'll have 700 schools participating, really on looking at allyship and activism this fall, on how they can stand up and speak out for their peers and as leaders on their own communities, be agents of change.
Thank you. And now the virtual walk.
The virtual walk, mark your virtual calendar for October 18th, where we will be walking in this community and all across the country, recognizing this is a marathon, not a sprint, and we'll take one step in the right direction at a time to bring people together, to stand up, to speak out, to say Dallas may have a history of not always making the best choices, but as a community, we are going to beat hate because we're going to do it together. After your toes are tired, kick them up and join us for the ADL virtual concert against hate the same evening. We will, from at the Kennedy Center, do our national concert highlighting 4 incredible stories that I think will be both inspiring and hopeful and really kind of frame the world that we have and the world that we're trying to achieve. One where, stopping the defamation of the Jewish people and securing justice and fair treatment for all are not mutually exclusive and can be done together simultaneously.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
It's been great. And I think, we can unmute everyone if people want to say hello across the Hollywood squares. Thanks for everyone for staying silent so that we could really hear Cheryl well.
Thanks, Cheryl.
Thanks, Cheryl. That was great.
Nice to see everybody.
Yeah, Shakara, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks, Brenda.
Thanks
Tina.
again to our community partners, Deborah for moderating this evening, Congregation Beth Torah, in 3-part harmony, education, rights, and sisterhood. And thank you, Cheryl and the ADL for helping to frame this and to illuminate us. And we look forward to better times.
Thank you.